Hello, I'm Elon Norbash, and welcome to my office. This video is going to be about demonstrating and introducing you to the GigaPan Epic and Epic 100 and the type of digital cameras that we find work really well with that equipment to take great panoramas. And what I have in front of me is an Epic 100. It's very similar to the Epic, except that it's bigger dimensionally, so it's wider and taller. And it has a slot that moves, and I'll be showing you that, so that it can accommodate larger cameras. But for the most part, the menus are similar, and I'm going to stick with this for simplicity to introduce you to the system. Let's start by talking about the hardware itself. We call this the robot, and then you've got the digital camera, and altogether you have the GigaPan system. The reason we call this a robot is it has moving parts. And let me just go through those a little bit with you and explain it to you. First of all, what is important about the panorama process is you want to be able to take your camera and point it in multiple orientations, take pictures one at a time, and then later take all those overlapping pictures and put them together into one giant, very high-resolution image that's explorable. So this robot needs to be able to hold your camera and move it around. On the bottom, we have a stepper motor. This is called the pan motor. You'll notice actually that on the bottom of this robot, there is a non-skid coating. That non-skid coating is nice because it means you can actually rest this on top of an object like a table or a railing in a museum and get pretty good shots even without a tripod. So that's the pan motor, and you can see that when the robot's off I can move it by hand. We have a tilt motor for the pitch of the camera, and that's right here. It's the same exact thing, and it also has a sort of non-slip surface on it. And I can move that by hand. It's not so easy on the Epic 100. You should be gentle with this. On the Epic, it has a lower gear ratio, and it's easier to move by hand because it's not designed for as heavy a camera. And the last motor we've got is a servo here, a servo motor, and that has a robotic finger attached to it. That's why this is a robot. So it can push down on the shutter to take pictures. And that's, of course, what makes this such a funny robot, since the only universal way we have of talking to inexpensive cameras is the shutter button. It makes a lot of sense to be able to push that down directly ourselves. So, a few more things about the robot. First of all, there is a level bubble here. That's very useful when you put this on a tripod to arrange and make sure that you're as level as possible so that your panorama comes out more or less straight. That's important. Another important point is a connection. The servo moves, and because it moves, we have to have this flexible cable here connecting it to the robot. If you were to unplug this, it's a cable that is just a 3-pin connector. And the trick with that is there's a big question, which is it's not necessarily obvious which way to plug it in. Now, the good news is if you plug it in wrong, when you turn the robot on, it says you've plugged in the cable wrong. So then you can try it the other way. The reason this is removable is because on the Epic 100, it's actually useful to be able to remove this and then plug in instead a remote trigger. And if you're using a camera like the G11 that we'll be talking about in a bit, you can actually unplug this, remove this unit altogether by unscrewing here. And you can put the G11 on here, you can get the cable from us that allows you to connect directly to the G11 from here. And then your robot will electronically tell the G11 to actually take the pictures. And so that works for the higher end point and shoot cameras that actually have remote triggers. Now, the other interesting thing to know about the system is, of course, the batteries. So let's talk about that. The batteries are in a compartment. Those of you who have used the old beta units see that this is quite different from that. Here we have a pretty easy way of taking the batteries in and out. They're just AA batteries. There's 6 of them. A few words about batteries. In general, I don't recommend that you use alkalines because they don't last very long. You're only going to get 3 or 4 panoramas out of alkalines, in my opinion. These are really nice high energy nickel metal hydride batteries. These are 2600 milliamp hours each, and that's a pretty good battery to use. So you want to go for batteries that have a lot of amp hours on board, and you want to use nickel metal hydride and have a nickel metal hydride battery charger. That's the way to go. With batteries like these, I can easily take 10 really large GigaPan panoramas in the field before I need to change batteries. And when we get to the robot, you'll see it actually tells you how many volts you have running, so you have an idea when you're running low on battery power. You know what I do is I actually leave the batteries in my backpack inside of this case, but separate from the robot when I go hiking, so that there's no chance that the buttons are going to get hit as I hike around and turn the thing on. And often I'll get to the panoramic place, and then I'll actually put the batteries in for the shot. So that's one nice way to protect yourself. So we'll put the batteries in. and we've talked about the lower mechanism of the system. It's time to talk about one of the most important things of all, which is actually placing the camera on the robot. So I have 3 different cameras here that I want to just talk about briefly, and then we'll use one of the cameras to really go through all the menus with you. These 3 cameras happen to be Canons. Of course, you can use any make of camera on the GigaPan. And let's start with the smallest one, actually. This tiny camera that I have here is called it's in the SD series from Canon. This is the SD780 IS ELPH. It's 12 megapixels. And it has, I think, a 3 times optical zoom. The reason this is a great choice is it's one of the smaller cameras from Canon that doesn't have too much vignetting, so it's reasonable that way. It has some zoom, it has pretty high quality optics, and you're able to do some of the most important things with this camera, even though it's a small point and shoot camera, which is, in this case, you can put it in what's called program mode on this camera, and then you can fix the exposure and the focus. And especially fixing the exposure turns out to be really important in GigaPans, because you want all the pictures that you take to have similar enough exposure that when you stitch them all together into one picture, the same sky doesn't look like it's different colors and different brightnesses, because that gets really, well, it gets ugly. So this is a small camera. This is in fact the camera that we use educationally. Now at the other end, if you have an Epic 100, it's a rather large unit, and it has this particular trick. The plate on which the camera sits actually comes out, and the dimensions of this area are quite large. And so you can put really large point-and-shoot cameras that are essentially nearly DSLRs on this. This is a nice example. This is a PowerShot SX10 IS. It's sort of the successor to the old SX100 series. And what's great about these cameras is they have a fantastic zoom. This has a 20 times optical zoom. In fact, 20 times optical zoom is so good that you'll often want to decide during your GigaPan shooting, do I really want to use full zoom, or is this 180-degree picture something where I only really need about half of my zoom? So whereas on the small ELPH, you're always going to full zoom, it becomes natural and automatic to do that. On a camera like this, you're really going to make decisions about zoom. Because this is a Canon camera and is pretty high-end, the menus on it are nearly identical to the PowerShot G11. And so I'm going to use the G11, and I'll talk about why. And that menus that you see on there transfer extremely well to this, and actually also to the small PowerShot ELPH, the SD780 that we talked about. So that's the really large camera, and indeed it fits on the Epic 100. Now, the camera that we're going to be talking about right now is the G11. This is one of my favorite cameras from Canon, and I like it because it's very compact. This is the best camera that we can recommend for the Epic. So the Epic 100 will fit this nearly DSLR version of the SX10 IS, but the Epic doesn't have this retractable plate, and it's actually a little bit smaller on the inside, which is great for hiking, but it does fit the Canon G11, which is an outstanding camera. And I think it reminds me of some of the old SLRs I used to use because it has these dials on top. So this is the camera we're going to use today, and I'm going to use this camera to show you how you go about mounting your camera on your robot. So first let me lock these side units because we don't need them to be extended for this camera. Now in putting the camera on the robot, the first thing to do is to realize that often there's some things you need access to before you lock your camera down. In particular, in the case of the G11, the SD card is down here and the battery is down here. I almost always use at least a 4 GB SD card, usually a 16 GB SD card. I highly recommend you use something nice and large because you want to be able to take 400 or 500 pictures at the maximum resolution offered without even worrying about running out of memory. And of course, in this case, the battery is down here. And so between the battery of the camera and the batteries in the Panorama, I can take something like 10 panoramas, and then it's time to change both batteries out. All right, let's go ahead and look at how to mount this on the robot. The first thing we do is notice that there's a 1/4 inch screw on the Epic 100. It's the same on the Epic, and it just slides left and right in the slot. That sliding is important because it lets us adjust the left-right position of the camera. We're going to take the regular 1/4 inch hole that you might use to mount your camera to a tripod. And instead of mounting to a tripod, we'll mount directly to here. I like to get the robot arm out of the way, and then I'll turn this so I have some room and I can see what I'm doing, and off we go. You'll notice that the screw is captive, so it won't fall out of the robot when it's not connected to a camera, which is nice. I screw that in part ways, and this is on a rubberized mount, so it's pretty safe. It won't slide very easily. Once I've screwed it in part way, I'm going to sight the lens to this diamond. And this diamond and this notch are important because they represent the center of rotation of the robot. So we want the center of the lens to correspond to that. And so now by having the slot be loose, I can move left and right like that. And I'll stop when the center of rotation is roughly right, which is about there. And then I'll tighten it down. So that's one adjustment that we make every time we load the camera onto the robot. Now let's talk about centering the camera in general. As I take pictures here, I've got this GigaPan Epic Pro in front of me, and then I've got my bookcase further behind. And there's a problem. As this pans and tilts like that, if the foreground moves relative to the background, that means if there's parallax, then the pictures aren't going to stitch together. Because if I line up the Pro, the bookcase will be out of alignment. If I line up the bookcase, the Pro will be out of alignment. So it's really important to do your best to cause the camera, as it's moving by the robot, not to induce any parallax. Now there's something called NPP, no parallax point, or the nodal point. The idea is we want the optical center of the camera to be what the robot rotates about, so that nothing moves in the environment, kind of like what your eyeball does when you look around. So we've already adjusted for the center of the optics in the left-right direction using that diamond. Now we need to adjust up, down, and forward and backward. We do both up, down, and forward and backward using a single adjustment system, and that's right here on the side arm. So I'm going to unscrew it and show you how that works. There is a slot on this arm that slides forward and backward, and that lets us make a fore-aft adjustment. At the same time, this screw isn't in the middle of this disc, and so by rotating the disc, you'll notice that the screw moves up and down. So I can make a vertical adjustment that way, and I can move the center of where I'm pivoting my fore-aft adjustment. In the vertical direction, what I want is, vertically I want the lens's center and the center of this disc to be the same, which in this case means roughly right there, right about straight with the G11. Now that's great because in the vertical sense, that means as I move about, I'm not going to be inducing parallax. Now let's talk about the hard one, forward and backward. Now I'll give you the bad news first. Let me go ahead and tighten this right around here for now. The bad news is, on a camera system that has zoom, the fore-aft nodal point moves depending on how zoomed in you are. And that's a surprise to some people. So in particular, when I zoom in all the way like this, what happens is I zoom forward and zoom into the picture, the nodal point moves back, and in fact is very close to the back of the camera. Whereas if I zoom out and pull back and get a wide angle view, the nodal point moves forward. So you will have to experiment with your camera and try and find a position for the zoom that you typically use. Now with the G11, I always zoom it in all the way. And I happen to know that when I'm zoomed in all the way in a situation like this, I want the camera pretty far forward. So I'll put it way forward like that. So that's what I would do on the G11. So the interesting news is you can actually use your eyes to estimate where the nodal point is fore-aft. So when I look in that lens and zoom in, I can actually see what looks like the back of the lens to me. Your eyes do a really good job of estimating where the back is. And when you zoom out, you'll actually see what looks like the back of the lens move forward. So that's pretty cool. It's a nice way of telling what's going on. That's one point. The second point is you can do research on the internet, and we have a website even on which we talk about where the nodal point is for various cameras. So there's ways for you to get more information. Third, you can actually experiment. So you can take your camera, put it on a GigaPan, and you can set up a scene where you have something close and something far away, and you can literally move the robot back and forth, taking care that you're rotating on the base, and you can see if the handle is moving or not, and you can adjust this until it's clear to you that the object that's close isn't moving relative to the background, as you just spin this left and right like that. And that works perfectly well too. Last, but certainly not least, if you're taking a picture of the Grand Canyon, this doesn't matter. That is to say, if everything's pretty far away, there is no parallax issue. If you close one eye and move your head around, nothing moves relative to anything else. This is a problem in a situation where you have a scene where you have quite close objects and far objects in the same scene. So for instance, a flower bed in your backyard, or an arboretum, or such. Also, this doesn't matter if you have a relatively flat world. So if you're in an art museum and you're taking pictures of some beautiful paintings and wall text on the wall, everything's roughly the same distance away, it just doesn't matter nearly as much. So you also should think about the context and think about whether you need to worry about this or not. That's all we need to discuss for those adjustments. The next one is the robot arm. So the finger has two adjustments. One is height in that direction, and the other allows you to do two dimensions of adjustment, and that's this. Now for height, what I like to do is I like to push up on the finger and then give myself enough height to get in here and adjust the zoom. I want to be able to comfortably adjust the zoom. And it's perfectly fine to have 2 or 3 centimeters of space here. That's all right. So now I'll go ahead and bear down on that screw. Now to actually adjust so that I'm hitting the actual trigger button head on, what I like to do is center it, push down on the trigger, be sure that I'm in the right place, and then tighten this down. One of the places that you'll commonly find people have made mistakes with the GigaPan is they'll adjust the robot trigger finger carelessly. It'll be right on the edge of the button. It'll work for the first 40 pictures, and then maybe it'll stop working for 5 pictures. And that's a shame, because they go home, they have this beautiful 45 picture panorama, and the last 5 pictures never got taken. There's 2 ways to deal with that. First of all, of course, pay attention to the trigger button, make sure you've tightened this down well. Second of all, and just as important, pay attention to the GigaPan while you're taking your panorama. Make sure you're looking and are assured that in fact the pictures are getting taken just when you expect them to be taken. So I want to start by talking about setting up the camera. And some of the things I'm going to talk about are setup issues that you need to do once. You'll have the menus set up correctly for GigaPanning. Other issues I'm going to talk about are things like exposure lock that you're going to have to do every time you're taking a panorama all over again for that situation, for that specific context. So let's go through background setup first and talk about the modes that these cameras have and what really matters to make a good panorama. So now we're going to talk about the menu, and these are the settings that you're going to make essentially once, and then this will be appropriate for all panoramas. Now I've hit the menu button to get to this mode. You just hit the menu button to get in and out of it. And so we'll go back into menu, and I'm going to walk you down the menu items that are most important for GigaPanning. First of all, digital zoom. Let's talk about digital zoom. You want it off. And the reason is you want each picture you take to be as high resolution, as high fidelity as possible. And the digital zoom is simply amplifying the picture without using optics. So you want maximum optical zoom, but no digital zoom. The next one that matters, in terms of autofocus, it doesn't matter so much because you're often going to be taking GigaPans without autofocus. And there are situations in which you will use autofocus. In a situation where you're in that art museum and everything is flat, it makes a lot of sense to nail the focus and lock it. And I'll show you how to do that on this camera, and other cameras have similar ways to do it. In a situation where you are in that arboretum and things are close and far away, autofocus can be good because it's kind of like focus stacking. You're taking a picture of the close object, close, focused on it, and you're taking a picture of the far object, far, focused on it. And that can be very useful. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about pausing and retaking, because there's nice ways to trick the camera into giving you just the right focus on each picture. The next one that matters a whole lot is review. I've got review set to 2 seconds, and that is good because longer than 2 seconds gets in the way of taking the GigaPan and attending to what's going on. 2 seconds gives you enough time so that as the robot is taking pictures, you can see on the screen what happened. Did that van that was driving by get in the picture and ruin it? Should I pause and go back and retake that from the robot? Or am I fine? Are the pictures getting taken at all? Or is my finger missing, or is the memory card full? Review information. I sometimes have it off and sometimes have it on detailed. Both are acceptable. Detailed is nice because you get the histogram. And the histogram allows you to make sure that you don't have pixels that are saturated off the right end or completely black off the left end. As long as your pixels are somewhere in the middle, you can imagine post-processing with image editing tools and making sure that you can adjust things like the brightness. But if you've got pixels all the way at the right end or all the way at the left end, the problem is there's no information. And so it's very difficult to adjust those and make them better. So, review mode is really important. I leave it on 2 seconds typically. Let's talk about image stabilization, IS mode, or some cameras call it anti-vibration. Image stabilization is a funny beast. The problem is the GigaPan acts neither like a tripod nor like a human holding the camera. It moves quickly and stops and takes a picture. And so image stabilization's computer gets all confused. Am I on a tripod? No, I'm moving. Whoop, now I'm really steady. I must be on a tripod. And as it switches back and forth between those two guesses, it moves the image and you can end up with blur. So we tend to recommend leave image stabilization off. Now, if you're in a windy situation, if you're in a situation with vibration, of course you should experiment. And there's lots of reasons why that's a good place to go and experiment and see if image stabilization happens to help you or not. Let's now go to the next menu, which is the Tools menu. And I'm going to go down to an important part of this, which is the power saving side. So I'm going to click in on power saving, auto power down. Because it takes time to set up the GigaPan robot and camera and decide what your frame is going to be, it's really frustrating to be doing that whole thing and then have the camera turn itself off in the middle. So we recommend turning off auto power down. By the same token, display off is something you want to not have happen for as long as possible. Go for the maximum. Keep that camera on and operating properly. Warning, in some of these cameras, including this one, if the display turns itself off, you will often lose things like auto exposure lock and autofocus lock. Actually, correction, the G11 doesn't do that, but I'm quite sure that the SD780 does that. So you really want to make that number large if possible. That's power saving, and that's the other really important aspect that I wanted you to see. That's it. So now we can go out of the menu. And let me talk a little bit about how I typically set up my whole system for gigapanning on an Epic or an Epic 100 base. So what I'll do is set up my tripod, of course, and this is heavy, so you're going to put it on a nice sturdy tripod, not a $18 tripod, but something a little more expensive than that. And you set your system up, or you put it on a tabletop. Before I turn the GigaPan Epic or Epic 100 on, because I can move this by hand relatively easily, I'll actually go through and set up the camera. And I want to go through that process with you for a really unusual GigaPan. We're going to take a GigaPan of some historical GigaPan units that are behind me on the shelf. So what I do at this point is I'll set up the shot first by zooming in all the way, making sure I understand the level of resolution I'm going to be at. And then I'll go in and actually start to adjust the things that matter in a day-to-day sense. Now I've put the display mode in such a setting that I actually see everything. And an important point to make to you is, if we look at the top of the camera, it's in M, or manual mode. That's very important. We need as much consistency between the shots as possible. So we want the same exposure. We want certainly the same white balance. Otherwise, we'll get different color temperatures, and as we knit these together, it'll look very odd. So I typically put that in manual mode. I'll typically put the ISO on the finest level of detail possible. These small point and shoots have relatively small image sensors, and so a low ISO is particularly meaningful. As we talk about pro units, you can of course use much higher ISO values, and that's just fine. But on these cameras and the signal to noise ratios they have, you really want to go for 80 or 100 if you can. I'm going to leave it on 100 right now. When I'm outside, I always use 80 without fail. So we're in manual mode. We've got ISO of 100. That's two of the settings that you're making. Now let's go and look at the settings on screen. I'm going to go ahead and hit the middle of the little donut here called function set and walk down. We don't want auto white balance. You can see auto white balance showing here. Instead of auto white balance, what we want to do is pick a specific white balance that we're going to use across the entire panorama. In this case, it's a cloudy day. There's also some fluorescent lighting in here, so let me see which looks better. That's way too blue, so we'll go with cloudy day. There we go. So we've chosen our white balance setting. Now let's go down the rest of this menu. This has a neutral density filter, which is essentially like sunglasses for the camera. We don't want that because I want to get in as much light as possible. What does matter here, I want to take single shots. Every time I have the robot press the button, I want a single picture to get taken. That's fine. And I want large. In other words, I want the highest resolution, super fine setting possible. And typically with any camera you're using, you're going to go for the largest and most super fine version of resolution that's available on the camera. That's really important. In general, we recommend you go ahead and use JPEG mode. So if your camera supports RAW and JPEG, go ahead and use JPEG unless you need to make significant post-processing modifications to the images before you upload them to the stitcher. In which case you could go to RAW, do all sorts of work because you've contained as much information as possible, and then save as JPEG and send to the stitcher. The stitcher also supports 16-bit TIFF, so you can do 16-bit TIFF, you can do 8-bit JPEG. Okay, so that's the image size. That's it for the left side of the display. Now, on the right side of the display, it's important to note the flash is off. You don't want your flash on. For obvious reasons, we're taking hundreds of pictures, we'll use up the battery. We're in manual mode, which is exactly what we want, because that allows us to adjust the shutter speed and the iris. Now, let's talk a little bit about the iris and about the shutter speed. On this camera, when you're zoomed in all the way, f4.5 is as small as it gets, as the f-stop gets. And that means that the aperture can only be so wide, not very wide, in fact. And in this situation that's pretty dark, I'd be going for as big as it gets, and then I'd be adjusting the shutter. But let's talk about iris a little bit. There's some interesting problems you get into. With all of these digital cameras, as you make the iris really small, that means when you make the f-stop really large, you get into a diffraction problem. And with GigaPans, you really care about how crystal clear that image is. As your iris gets really small and you get diffraction, it gets softer. It gets blurrier, actually. So this is something you should experiment with. On the G11, for example, I try very hard to never go beyond about f5.6, because you really start having significant diffraction problems. And I stay as big as I can. But there's a trade-off, right? Because if your iris is large, then you have very shallow depth of field. So especially if things are close like this and you're zoomed in all the way, it's very difficult to get everything in focus at the same time. So my preference, if nothing's moving, is keep that iris large, make the shutter speed nice and long if I have to. Now let's talk about what happens at night, because sometimes you're going to want to do that. And it's nighttime and you want a big iris, and no matter what you do, you have a 2 or 3 second exposure. So how do you do that? Well, you'll do the 2 or 3 second exposure, but in a situation like that, I'll do something else. I'll actually introduce a 2-second timer. Now this is nice, because if you have a 2-second timer, then you can have a nice long exposure, and when you press the button on the camera, it waits 2 seconds and then takes a picture. By the time it takes a picture, there's no vibration, there's nothing moving. And so that 2-second timer gives you the chance of everything being still. And in nighttime photography or museum photography, I find that 2-second exposure especially useful. Now I'm going to go ahead and turn off the 2-second exposure so that it takes pictures instantly for now. And so now what we've got is a 1/20th of a second f4.5 in this relatively dark situation. Now, once you've identified all of those settings, there's one other setting you have to be aware of, which is the focus. We talked about this a little bit before. If you're in a scene where everything's at the same distance, go to manual focus, nail the focus, and be done. Or infinity, if you're in the Grand Canyon situation. In a situation where things are truly at different focuses, you can try leaving autofocus on and see how it does. Although you may find that when you get to things like the clouds in the sky, it does poorly. You could pause it during the GigaPan, during the Panorama acquisition. You can pause it, go back and change the focus setting. So you can be in manual and go to infinity at that point, or you can be in autofocus and switch to manual and go to infinity, and then you can resume taking the panorama on the blue sky that way. So that's an idea for dealing with the fact that some places should be autofocus, and some places you want to lock the focus because they don't have enough contrast, enough detail for focusing to work well. That describes everything we need to know about taking the pictures with the camera. One of the important next steps is actually trying it out. So I'll take a picture, then once I've taken the picture, I'll go and look at it. So I'm going to go to the mode where you're looking at the pictures. I'll zoom in, look at it in gory detail, and wow, I've got a nice picture. I'm able to see the little buttons on the old-fashioned GigaPan unit quite well. I'm seeing little chinks in the aluminum. So now I'll zoom out. So now I know that the pictures the camera takes are reasonable. In this case, it's autofocus, and the autofocus is doing a good job at that distance, which is not surprising. Great. So I'm happy with the quality of the picture, and I've set up my camera. That covers everything that I go through with the camera to make sure it's prepared and ready for the panorama acquisition, in this case, of my bookshelf. Now we turn our attention to the robot. So now let's look at the menus that the Epic 100 has, which are largely similar to the ones that the Epic has. When you turn it on, you have the new panorama menu, and I'm going to grab the pen. You already know what new panorama does. It allows you to set the top, left, bottom, right corners and take your panorama. The next menu to show you is 360 panorama. That's a nice selection where you know you want to get pictures all the way around. When you choose this menu, it simply has you choose the top edge and the bottom edge of the panorama using the top and bottom keys, and then it takes all the pictures around. We'll go into the next menu, last panorama. Last panorama is really interesting, and there's some nice special effects you could do with it. Last panorama takes the boundaries of the previous panorama you just took, goes to the top left corner, and lets you take it again. You can actually use the right, left, up, down keys to move the robot to any cell in the panorama and then start there and start taking pictures. So you can be surgical. You can take a panorama, let's say, of the bush in South Africa on a safari. Then you can wait for a giraffe to show up. You can click last panorama and then use these to manually move the camera until you have the giraffe in the center of a frame. And you're snapped to the grid, so you're in the panorama grid. And then you can press the button by hand or with the robot trigger and get that giraffe. And then on the stitcher side, you can drop that picture in by replacing the picture of that part of the bush with the picture with the giraffe in it. Now you have a picture with the giraffe. So last panorama is really quite effective for fast forwarding, going to a particular place and surgically modifying pictures for yourself. Options, we're going to go ahead and enter that and look at some very important options. First one, time per picture. This is a big deal. The robot doesn't know directly when the camera is done taking a picture. And so the robot needs to be told by you how many seconds to wait between pictures. Now my default when I'm outside is 3 seconds. 3 seconds is enough time that I can take a 100-picture panorama and it doesn't take forever, right? It's only a couple of 3 minutes. And 3 seconds is usually enough time where outside, if the exposure is really fast on the camera, you're going to be all right. You're going to have enough time for the camera to do its thing. However, that's not the case for indoor photography and especially for dark photography. Let's say you're in a situation in a museum or a dark night scene where, in fact, the camera is spending, let's say, 1.5 seconds exposure. Well, if you set that thing to 1.5 seconds exposure, especially on some of these cameras, once you get above 1 or 2 seconds exposure, they'll do a 1 second or 2 second exposure, then they'll close the shutter for 2 seconds, do another exposure to get a measurement of the black noise. And they'll compare those to create the best picture they can. So suddenly your 2 second exposure is taking 4 seconds. And then it has to write the picture to the SD card. So you take 4 seconds plus something. So now the shutter delay needs to go from 3 seconds, which gives you just enough time to move and be ready and finish review mode and get ready to shoot again, all the way to something like 8 or 9 seconds. So don't be shy about making this number large. One of the worst things that can happen to you is you're in an excellent shot situation, you've set this to some number that's borderline, it's just barely working, and it's working, and you get to a picture that happens to have a lot of detail in it, so the JPEG compression doesn't compress it as much. So it takes a little longer to write to the SD card than your other pictures. So the camera's not quite ready. And so in this nice picture that you're capturing most of, you end up going home and realize that in this 200-picture panorama, there's these 2 very detailed pictures, you're just missing the picture after them, because the picture after them never got taken. So that's a reason to make sure you're not in a boundary case with that number. Below time per picture, the next menu is battery status. That's a nice menu. It's indicating that we're at 7.3 volts right now, which is a pretty good value to be at with the batteries. Anything above 7 volts tells me that the batteries are in reasonable shape. And we'll go down again. Start delay. Start delay is really useful if you want to be in the picture, or if you are in a situation where, for instance, you're putting your GigaPan unit and camera on a hot air balloon and setting it up in the sky. Not that I've done that myself, but you can imagine doing that. So start delay allows you to go in and say, when I say start the panorama, don't start for 15 seconds, 30 seconds, and you can keep going up to 10, 15 minutes. So you can essentially delay the entire panorama acquisition to whatever you like. That's start delay. Next, multiple shutter. This is a feature that's on Epic 100, but not on the Epic. Multiple shutter is suggesting, instead of taking just a single picture at that location, take multiple pictures. And that's fantastic if you intend to take multiple pictures and do some kind of high dynamic range work with that, or multifocal planing work. Factory reset is doing the obvious thing. Expert options. Expert options are interesting. It's worth taking a quick look at them. Button hold is this question of whether you want the robotic finger to continuously press the shutter button for the 3 seconds that it's pressing it for, or to press it and release it. Some people feel that pressing it continuously induces less vibration because you're not actually moving it twice. And so there's a debate there, and you can play with it and let us know what you think. Checklist allows you to set whether you want a checklist to be shown or not. Just now when I used the GigaPan, there was no checklist. But there's a nice checklist you can turn on that asks you questions like, did you fix the white balance? Did you lock the focus? Did you lock the exposure? And so checklist is very useful for these kinds of operations. Shutter method is asking the question, are you using the robotic button pusher, or are you using some other technique for using the shutter, like a remote trigger or a manual point? So the remote port, if you were to hit OK, says I'm actually using the remote port to trigger this with a trigger. Manual is saying the human being is going to press the button on the camera, so don't worry about pressing the button for me. And that's it. Picture ordering is another really interesting menu. Let me go ahead and enter that and show you what's going on. Right now we're in column mode. And column mode means we start at the top left. We take our picture by running down the column, coming to the right, and doing that again. So we're taking the picture a column at a time. Instead, we could actually choose to take the picture in row mode or down, or row mode up. Row mode down means we start at the top and we scribe down. Row mode up means we start at the bottom and we scribe up. Let's talk about why you would want to use these modes. Typically, if you're capturing something where the light's changing rapidly or there's motion, say a sunset, it's very important to you that the adjacent pictures are taken quickly in rapid succession. So row mode makes a lot of sense. In fact, I'll often take sunset shots with row mode up, because as the sun sets, the grass in front of the sun is going to become dark quickly. So I want to capture the grass, capture the sunset at just the right time, and I can even pause it and then continue it when I get to the horizon at just the right moment. And then I want to capture the sky as it's very colorful as the sun sets. And again, you could pause it if you want for fun, wait for the color of the sky to start to become quite saturated, and then take the pictures. By the same token, row mode is really useful if you're looking at a really crowded situation, like a baseball game, and there's motion, because people don't move up and down, they move sideways. So the faster you can take the pictures sideways, the better. Column mode turns out to be really nice for landscapes where nothing's moving, just because I'm used to it, and I enjoy that I'm getting some sky, making sure the exposure is right, getting the ground, making sure the ground looks good. So it really tests the full range of exposures and distances for me on that very first column, and then I know everything's going to be good. So that's the picture ordering situation. And there's a backlight mode and a motor mode and a firmware version, and that's it. So that's the expert options. Now we're going to move to the most important menu of all at the top level. It's called GigaPan Setup. You've already noticed that we took that example panorama and the GigaPan robot had to move between pictures. Well, the question is, how did it know how many degrees to move? That depends. Depending on the camera you use, when you put it at full zoom, you may have to move 3 degrees. You may have to move 15 degrees between pictures. It's tricky because you want adjacent pictures to have some overlap, say 30% or so. You don't want 70 or 80% overlap because you're wasting your time and you're wasting camera and memory space. It's just too much overlap. You don't want too little overlap because the stitcher needs to have enough pixels in common in the scene that it can calibrate and align those pictures just right. So it needs details that match up, like that pine tree in the distance being in both pictures, so that it can make sure it's perfectly aligning everything and creating one seamless panorama. So GigaPan Setup is going to allow us to do that, and I want to just show you how that works. So we're going to go ahead and hit OK, and then we're going to go up and down to the camera and show you what you do. Current field of view, 10.8 degrees. Now once you do this a few times, you'll know what the right field of view is for your camera. I'm going to go ahead and hit OK to change it. It's going to say use buttons to align horizon with the top of the camera screen. Of course, first you want to set your camera to whatever zoom you're intending to use. I'm zoomed forward all the way, which is what I want. And what I'm going to do is just pick something in the image, in this case the white cable there. And I'm going to set it by going on the up-down button until it's on the very top of the screen. Then I hit OK. And it says reference set. Then it says use buttons to align the horizon, or that object, with the bottom of the camera screen. So now I'm simply going to use the up button to move that cable down. Now as I move that cable down in the image, it's showing me the current degrees field of view as measured by the stepper motors. So right now I'm 4.2 degrees, there's 5.8 degrees, and so on. I'll move the tip of that cable right to the bottom of the screen. Don't worry about overlap, it'll compensate for overlap for you. And I'm at 11.5 degrees. Maybe I'll go down a little bit. Right there, 11.7 degrees, 11.5. All right, we hit OK. So now we've physically measured the field of view of the camera in the top up-down direction, and the robot now knows that number. That number is remembered by the robot even when you turn it off and take the batteries out. So as long as you're using the same camera, fully zoomed in on the same robot, you don't have to worry about that number. Of course, something that makes a lot of sense is while you're taking GigaPans with the camera, look at the pictures that are getting taken. Find something in the picture. And when it goes to the next position, make sure what you're seeing is a reasonable amount of overlap between the pictures. So again, you and your eyeballs and brain checking on the robot and making sure it's doing the right thing, there's no substitute for that. Okay, that's the set of GigaPan setups that we need to know about so we can actually take a picture. I'm going to go ahead and go to the top level, go back to New Panorama, and show you a few more tricks in taking a new panorama. So just to review this, we're going to take a new panorama by making sure the robot is ready. In this case, it's still got the same exposure settings it had before. We're going to hit OK. We're going to set the upper left. And now let's try and be careful of focus. So we're going to go on the top left of that early GigaPan. Then it's going to say set lower right. So we'll go down to the bottom right corner of the GigaPan unit, the beta unit on the right. I should say the beta unit on the right. So there's a 6x3 GigaPan. And by the way, I'm at a 6x3 GigaPan, that's 18 pictures. But it's 18 pictures and we don't have a real feel for whether we're at the very edges of what it could be at 30% overlap. I can go down and right all the way to there before it goes to 7x4. So you can actually play that game if you wish. So you're capturing the largest space you can with those 6x3 pictures. What it'll otherwise do is basically squish them together to get exactly the top left and bottom right corners that you're asking for. So I'm going to hit OK on that. But now I'm going to play a game to make sure I get the best focus that I can, just to show you an example. The first thing it says is show panorama, yes or skip. I'm going to say skip. I don't want to see the panorama. Take 18 pictures, yes or cancel. I'm going to say yes. But now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pay careful attention to the robot as it takes the pictures. If the picture looks focused, fine. I've got autofocus on. If the picture doesn't look focused, I'm going to pause it and show you what I do. So, taking panorama, press X to pause, column 1, row 1, off it goes. And it gets a picture in the dark, and it's actually well focused. So it goes to the next position and gets a good picture. And here's a picture right below my business cards. Oh, that was really fuzzy. So I'll pause this. I paused it, but the robot's moved on to the next picture. So I'm going to go back one to go back to the bad picture. So this is the picture that was bad, right? So what I'm going to do is put my hand out here, make sure that it can focus well by pushing halfway down, and then I'll take the picture. There we go, much better focus. And now I'll tell it to continue. I'll go forward one to the next position because I took that picture for it. And now I'll hit OK, go ahead and continue taking pictures. So don't feel shy about getting in the way of the robot that way, making sure that it's taking a good picture for you. You could even have gone in and changed to manual focus mode. Now, I'm going to go ahead and stop this because we don't actually need all these pictures. So now we've covered the settings that the GigaPan Epic has and the Epic 100 has in terms of setting up your image and your picture and your panorama and making sure that you're in tune with the robot, the camera, and how long the camera is taking to take pictures. And we've gone over the camera. Now let me just talk about one more advanced issue, which is vignetting, and then we're done. So vignetting. The problem that you've got is that a lot of these cameras, including the G11, when you zoom them in all the way, especially when you have that wide open aperture that I said is good, what will happen is the light beams coming in through optics that aren't perfect. They're not thousands of dollars worth of optics. And they're hitting an imaging chip that is pretty small. And the boundaries of the image can be quite dark. Now, this isn't typically a problem if you're taking pictures of grass or a forest or trees or people. But if you have something that's really homogeneous and bright in a color but not saturated, not bright white or black, so let's say the blue sky, you got a problem. Because each of those pictures that it's taking of the blue sky, the middle of it is bright and the edges are dark. So when the stitcher gets done, the picture is splotchy. So what you need to do is understand what it takes to make vignetting as small as possible a problem. First of all, good cameras, the better the camera, the better the optics, often the better the vignetting, and you can ask that question. Second of all, you can do post-processing, so you can programmatically go in and correct the pictures for vignetting, and much more advanced cameras actually have lenses that are designed to correct for vignetting. Third thing you can do, keep the aperture a little smaller. So try making the aperture smaller, see if that solves part of your problem, so that you don't have as broad an aperture and as much of a fringe of the lens being used. And those are the kinds of issues that you need to think about whenever you have that beautiful blue sky and you want to get one beautiful homogeneous piece of blue sky captured. So good luck with that. That's the vignetting problem that you'll see. Remember though that making your aperture small introduces the other problem, which is diffraction. So if you make your aperture really small to try and get away from vignetting, eventually you're going to lose some sharpness because of diffraction. So there is a happy medium, and you want to try and forge toward the medium as much as possible. Now the SD780 is a great educational unit because it's inexpensive and it's tiny, easy for kids to use. And I want to show you briefly how you fix the exposure and the focus on this camera, because it's not quite the same. Everything else in the menus is exactly the same, but the way you fix the exposures is a little different. And I put it in program mode. I'm going to zoom it in all the way. So in those senses, it's very much similar to the camera we were using before. But here's the trick with fixing exposure, which again is very important. You always want to fix exposure. So on the SD780, what you need to notice, first of all, is there's a little donut here around the function set button. Now function set and the donut exist on the bigger cameras. Here it's just much, much smaller and harder to see. And ordinarily you would use the donut to do things like turn the flash on and off, which of course is important, and turn on the timer. And as you'll recall, the timer is great because you can use it to introduce, for instance, a 2-second delay so that at night you can get great GigaPan shots. The donut is also not labeled this way, but you can use it to lock the exposure and the focus, and that's very important. So here's how would you do that. We can push down on the shutter, and then we can push up on the top of the donut where there's a blue rectangle, and it locks the exposure. It makes the adjustment itself, so it decided 1/5 of a second, f5.8. But the good news is it's locked now. So all the pictures will be at that same exposure. So you'd have to hunt to find the right place to lock the exposure like that for your overall panorama. To lock focus, you push down halfway on the shutter and you hit the left side of the donut where the mountain and flower are. And then AFL shows up, autofocus lock, and now all the pictures will have that focus point. Again, very useful in certain situations, although I do recommend that you play with having focus in autofocus mode some of the time with GigaPan.